Is the democratization of information a good thing?
Yeah, although I think we would have to peel back what exactly it means to democratize information. I, in my view, I would start from the standpoint that we have a national security state that classifies way too much information,
Mm-hmm.
and begin from that standpoint. Of course, there are different types of information that you and me will never get to read. Aside from the information that is in the hands of security or intelligence agencies or the military, and they say we can't read it, there are what get treated as like trade secrets, but they aren't really. There's economic or corporate documents that are in the hands of private executives, and they conceal their actions as they are, engaged in, as what we'll call, for lack of a better phrase, rapacious capitalism, in the sense that they do not, all they care about is extraction and maximizing profits. And we're not going to be able to read
Mm-hmm.
what their intentions or aims are. Like, for example, like ExxonMobil, now it's very well known that like 50 years ago, they knew the way that the climate was going to be destroyed through their actions, but they kept that secret as long as possible so people didn't know that they were aware of their impact on the planet. And so you have this overclassification of information, and democratization is a crude way of putting it, because there are going to be players who are trying to release different sets of documents for their own personal agendas, and we may not necessarily support those personal agendas. But by and large, as a journalist, I do uh, have to say that my responsibility is to whether the documents that are released are authentic and have truth within them, and the motivations for why those documents are disclosed are not irrelevant, but they should not mean that I don't show an interest in what has been exposed. So if I believe that certain information is in the public interest and should not be kept secret, then I think it is a benefit to democracy and justice that we have access to those documents.
It is interesting because I was thinking this as I was reading your book, and I thought about, was it last year or early this year? I can't remember, where there was a guy on the internet that had worked for the military that was like,
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
yeah. And one of the conversations we had on this show was that so much gets classified that doesn't really need to get classified. That this idea of leaking, I mean, 700,000 documents is a lot. I refuse to believe in 700,000 every single thing you read was of utter importance. I'm sure there was a lot of like, no one needed to know that. There is it feels like, and you kind of talk about this in the book, that there is this over classification. Maybe it's just supreme protection, right? I mean,
yeah.
If I was in power, I definitely wouldn't want my emails getting leaked.
Although, if I could add something to what you're saying about the
Please.
700,000 documents, that's you're so the reason why you publish the whole set is because government officials lie. And what will happen if you don't post the entire set of documents, assuming that you have been given all of what can be called a set, is because someone is going to come out there and say that, oh, well, that's what these documents show, but they didn't publish these files that actually do show we care about civilians and we aren't just systematically targeting them with airstrikes. Or, uh, they're going to try and find a way to weasel around accusations that might be leveled against the government based on what has been exposed. And I'm not just making that up. That is the reason why Daniel Ellsberg released all of the study, which was thousands upon thousands of pages. And in that time, he went to the trouble to go Xerox every single page and make several copies that were distributed to dozens of newspapers in the United States so he could beat Richard Nixon and the administration's efforts to have publication blocked in the media. Of course, he failed. What we probably call the Streisand effect now took hold, where it was not possible to fight the newspapers anymore because it was already out. And all, so he's in court fighting the New York Times. Meanwhile, the St. Louis Post Dispatch is releasing the Pentagon. It's lost now.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
out there for everybody.
How do you feel about that? I know this is a bit of a personal question. How do you feel about the fact that information is out there for everybody? Twitter is a news source for mainstream media at this point in 2024 and has been for a little bit. Maybe Obama starts it, but Trump definitely makes it his way to his decrees through Twitter. Had Joe Biden not been so old and senile, he probably would be doing the same things. It'd be a lot easier for him to tweet than, roll that man out. How do you feel about the fact that there's so much that gets dumped on people at once? And when we think about investigative journalism, for me, the thing that I enjoy about reading good investigative journalism is that someone like yourself, for example, this is 10 years of your life in this book. And it's not just Julian Assange. Of course, you were covering Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, and Assange is a part of this broader story. But this is 10 years of you digging deep, literally going to a trial. And are we losing that with kind of the loss of newspapers and even local weeklies that used to have great investigative journalism? I toured as a musician for years, so I loved grabbing the local weekly, whatever town I was in, and finding out what the scuttlebutt was on the city. And that's fading. And I think that's a sad problem that I don't think many Americans acknowledge or care that much about. Journalism isn't what it I don't want to say is what it used to be. It's a harder field to get into. It's expensive. You go to school for it now. What's your take on that?
Well, so I donate to my local weekly here in Chicago, the Chicago Reader. They managed to get out from under some
Mega corporation
situation where some scum sucking capitalist was trying to ruin it, basically, and they tried to make it a kind of not-for-profit operation. It's always been valuable to me. It's where I know what movies, musicians are having shows, what theater shows are happening, what's the festivals that are coming to town, what kind of events are happening. Not to mention, they do very good social interest stories. So the idea that there wouldn't be one newspaper in your town that you could turn to as a resource is something that is being lost. What I hear in your question is a couple things. Primarily what I think of is when people are afraid of the endless stream of filth and just misinformation, and also sometimes it's just people who are vitriolic and taking out their rage on vulnerable groups, that we have to emphasize media literacy. So in an age when there's all kinds of information available, in an age when it can be weaponized, in an age when there are groups, not just political elites, but all kinds of different actors that can weaponize that information. The challenge is somehow helping people to understand what is being published and how to question that information and understand that information and where it's coming from. Obviously, um, one of the things that I've had to deal with as a journalist is this idea that, hey, you have to be objective or neutral as a journalist when you cover this story. And then there's a lot of discussion sometimes about media being biased or not biased. I ran a small media organization for several years. Unfortunately, my partner took a different path. It's defunct. But in doing that work, I learned how to put out stories and support independent journalists and provide freelance writers a hub for what they were doing. Um, and in my experience, one of the things is that it doesn't really matter if you have a point of view in doing that journalism. And in fact, that work is probably better if you have some personal knowledge or you've dug deep. So, when I started this work 10 or 15 years ago, I don't know if it's as popular today, but to have fully formed views about the value of whistleblowing, to have fully formed views that like the government classifies too much information, or to have the view that um, war is always a crime or something like that, that would be to your discredit as a journalist. But I just think that for me and my readers, what I would prefer to do, and what I think most people should probably find as being more reasonable, is to just not hide what you think and to let people engage with you. So I'm willing to be an open book and say that these are the perspectives that I have, while I put out accurate information. While I cover Julian Assange's case, for example, or Chelsea Manning's case, for example, in great detail. And I try not to steer people in any direction. I don't know if this has anything to do with your question, but I'll just throw out there that I try not to like steer people in any direction and say, like, here, I expect you to think about this. And if you don't, it's wrong. I think it's better to make all the information available. And then once people have been educated, then, I can contextualize it later. I can place it within an ideology. But I mean, I will say that I have political views that are left wing about many of these, but the book is not. The book is non-ideological, and I think that's probably the best way of getting to people, because there isn't a lot of consistent reporting on this to begin with. So first and foremost, I needed to make sure that people understood the basics, because let's just face it, many of the whistleblower cases that are part of the progression of how the Espionage Act has been weaponized, and then, after going after these certain individuals, now the U.S. Justice Department feels confident that they can go after a journalist in an unprecedented case. Um, I need to make sure that people are educated before I talk to them about ideas around it. So, I mean, like a follow up book might be to contextualize this. I've thought about things like whistleblowing against empire. I've thought about how uh, there's this concept that Noam Chomsky has popularized of unworthy and worthy victims. Well, in my head, I see unworthy and worthy whistleblowers. I see people who the media tells us we should support because of what they're exposing, and then there are those that they do not want us to support and pretend like they aren't whistleblowers, even though they're doing the exact same thing that other people are doing. And it usually just depends on what they're exposing. So if they're exposing something that everyone can get behind, like how Facebook is, I guess, preying on children, or allowing foreign governments to influence content, then
Yes.
they're for that. They want that whistleblower to get all the hearings, all the media interviews, all the attention. But somebody comes out there and is trying to expose war crimes in Iraq by the U.S. military. No, we can't have that. That's just too touchy for us.